As Vanessa said, I'm Dr. Renee Dorn, Director of Alumni Relations for GSEP, and I always like to thank our alumni for joining us for all of the lifelong learning sessions. It's such a pleasure to have you here, and we really appreciate you participating. So for today's speaker, Mr. Dan Schnur, and let me just say ahead of time, he is very accomplished. And I'm going to read some of his accomplishments so you just know how accomplished he is. So he is a professor at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications, where he teaches courses in politics, communications, and leadership. He's also taught at the John F. Kennedy School of Government's Institute of Politics at Harvard University and George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. He is the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll. He's worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns as one of California's leading political strategists. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of U.S. Senator John McCain and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. In 2010, he was appointed chairman of the California Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, where he implemented groundbreaking campaign finance disclosure requirements. He also was a founder and co-chairman of the Voices of Reform Project, and that is a bipartisan statewide effort whose work laid the foundation for California's landmark redistricting reform. After completing his FPP term, he registered as a no-party preference voter and launched Fixing California, an organization dedicated to campaign finance and political reform. His commentaries have appeared in a plethora of newspapers, and he has been an analyst and political commentator for CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and National Public Radio. He hosts a monthly live national webinar for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall called the Dan Schnur Political Report, and includes discussions with political leaders from both sides of the aisle and analysis of our most pressing political issues, ranging from domestic policy to geopolitics. He writes a weekly column for the All Sides Political website and for the Jewish Journal, where he is the U.S. political editor. He is a graduate of the American University in Washington, D.C., and he and his wife, Cecile Black, an international communications consultant and former deputy mayor of Los Angeles, they both live in LA. Please welcome to the podium, Professor Mr. Dan Schnur.
Well, thank you all so much for letting me join you here today. I've heard so much about this program, and I'm so excited of the chance to be here with you. Dr. Dorn, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It may not have sounded like all that much to some of you, but my students at the School of Public Policy, they handed in their final papers on Tuesday. So, Doctor, that is the nicest thing anyone has said about me in public all week long. Thank you very, very much. And of course, I also want to thank the Don Hockles for having us here today. It is so gracious and so kind and so generous of them. And even before we begin the academic portion of the program, it's such a wonderful lesson and reminder to all of us the importance of giving grace and being there for others when we can. And I think we're all very, very grateful to them. And I want to thank Vanessa John, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know through this program. And in addition to the work she does, which all of you are familiar, she's too modest to say so, but she is personally responsible for today's weather. And so we should thank her very, very much for that. Vanessa, very well done. I understand you, like you said, you were working on a few bugs on this last month, but I think you got this pretty well nailed. Okay. So I have had the great privilege and the great pleasure of teaching at the School of Public Policy. This is my 7th year there. And I must tell you, not just how much I've enjoyed it, and not just how much I've loved it, but how much I've learned from it, and how much I've learned from our extraordinary students. And for those of you who, in addition to your involvement in this programming, if you ever do have the occasion to visit campus, either to visit our incredible undergrads at Seaver or come up the hill to the Public Policy School, we would love to have you. But I'll warn you, the good side is you're going to be inspired. The downside, at least for me, is I think, oh my gosh, they are so much more impressive than I was when I was their age. But I really do consider it a privilege to be able to be with such smart, impressive young people every week. And it really is a privilege, and it really is a blessing for which I'm very, very grateful. Now, that said, before I get into the heart of today's conversation about our very uninteresting election season, I do want to share with you just a moment a pet peeve that I have about higher education. At Pepperdine, at USC, at Berkeley, at Stanford, at UCLA, at Harvard, at Yale, at Cal State Dominguez Hills. This is something that's really frustrated me for many years, and I'm going to share it with you before we get started. I have to admit, and I came to teaching, as Desiree and I were talking about a few minutes ago, relatively late in life, after, as Renee mentioned, after having worked on campaigns for many years. And one of the things that surprised me and frustrated me is how many professors at every school I've ever either taught or visited, how many professors misunderstand the privilege that we've been given. And how many of them, you don't mind me saying so, abuse that privilege. And the way they abuse that, far too many, is they make the curious, the questionable decision to use the bully pulpit, the privilege that they've been given, to inflict, and I choose the verb inflict very, very specifically, to inflict their own ideology from the left or the right on the students in their classes. And I tell my students at the beginning of every semester, not just at Pepperdine, but at my other schools as well, I tell them, I said, it's not my job to tell you what to think. I said, first of all, I think that shows a fundamental disrespect for a very intelligent young person to assume that I have, for some reason, been put in a position to tell them how they should consider and conclude about the great issues of the day. But I tell them, I said, so in this class, in this classroom, this semester, I want you to learn how to be analysts and not advocates. I said, there's nothing wrong with advocacy. Standing up for what you believe in is an honorable cause. But I also want you to be able to set that aside and to analyze the landscape. And more importantly than that, I want you to come to your own conclusions about the issues we're discussing. And if they happen to agree with me, well, that's great. But if they don't, well, that's just as great. Because the important thing is that they're your opinions and your insights and your decisions, not mine. And what happens, if you know Pepperdine students, you know that this is coming. What happens every single semester, sometimes in class, more often after class, is a student will come up to me and they'll say, don't you have opinions about these things? I said, no, not at all. Biden, Trump, yeah, either way, whatever. I said, of course I have opinions. I have very strong opinions. And so what I tell the class is I said, if you want to talk about what I think about the great issues of the day, and I really want to hear what you think about the great issues of the day, but not in class. Come to my office hours. Take me for coffee. I can be bribed. And right before finals, actually, I just handed it out on Tuesday. Right before finals, I hand out the grade for food matrix. If they take me to Starbucks, they're going from a B to a B plus. If they take me to Mastro's, they're going to get their doctorates. And I bring all this up because I come here today in the same spirit. I don't presume to know anything more about these issues than any of you do, because I know you're a very intelligent, well-read group. Otherwise, you wouldn't be part of this program. So what I'm going to do is not to tell you which party to support or which candidate to vote for or what issues to consider, because that's not my place and probably wouldn't listen to me anyway. What I'll do, just like I ask my students, is I'll offer some analysis, some overview. And if it can be of some help to you as you navigate this incredibly complicated political landscape over the next 7 months, and yes, there's 7 long months to go until election day, so brace yourself. Yeah, I know. Hopefully it can be of some help. And then what I'm very much looking forward to, by far my favorite part of these programs, is when the monologue ends and the conversation begins. And Vanessa gave me very specific directions on how long I should talk for, at which point we should go to questions. Vanessa, I hate to tell you this now, but I'm not going to honor that, because we're going to get to their questions much, much sooner than that, because this is a way too smart a group to keep waiting as long as we had discussed. So I hope you don't mind. Okay. So all that aside, let's talk about this upcoming campaign. And I'm going to talk about it in 2 contexts. Number one, I'd like to talk about the political landscape as it currently exists and what I'd encourage you to watch as the campaign unfolds between now and November. But then what I'd like to do is broaden the conversation a little bit and get beyond the horse race. Like I said, this is a very smart group, and what I don't want to do here is simply repeat for you what you can get on Fox or CNN or read in the news every day, but talk a little bit more maybe about how we got here. How did we get to a political landscape in which so many of us, so many of our fellow Americans, find that landscape to be such an unpleasant place? And what maybe we can do, not only as citizens, but as leaders, to maybe make that landscape a little bit better and a little bit more welcoming for people, particularly for young people who are just beginning to learn for themselves the benefits and too often the downsides of civic and community engagement. But let's start with the landscape in front of us. So here's what I know from my work on campaigns. And I had the great privilege, as you heard from Renee earlier, I had the great privilege of working on several campaigns, 4 for president of the United States, 3 for governor of California, and a bunch of others along the way before I fled to the ivory tower. But what I learned along the way is that any successful campaign, Republican or Democrat, has to do 2 things at the same time. Number one, a good candidate, a good campaign has to motivate their existing supporters. A good candidate, a good campaign recognizes who's their base and has to remind them, has to inspire them, has to excite them, to motivate them to participate in the political process. But the second task, just as important, but often contradictory, is a successful candidate has to reach beyond that base of loyal supporters and persuade undecided voters, at least a portion of them, to side with my candidate and my campaign rather than the opposite. Let me put this in language that I got clearance on to use at Pepperdine, my first semester teaching. I believe that in politics, there are 3 kinds of people. And the 3 kinds of people are as follows. And I want you to take this terminology in a political, not in a spiritual context. The 3 kinds of people I've learned about in politics over the years are as follows. They're saints. They're sinners. Vanessa, I don't know why I'm looking at you when I'm saying sinners. I have no idea, actually. Now we know, exactly. There are saints, there are sinners, and there are salvageables. And I'm going to define and of course, as I'm sure many of you are already thinking, this formulation works in plenty of other places in our society too. But this is the way I approach politics. A saint in a secular political context is someone who agrees with me. Someone who's going to vote for my party, for my candidates, for my goals. What could be more saintly? That's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer that because we know. And what we know is in most state and national elections, we know that roughly 40% of the voters, whether you are a Democratic or Republican candidate, roughly 40% of the voters are your party's saints. They're going to vote for you. Now, if 40% of the voters are saints, what that means logically is that 40% of the voters are sinners. And one of the unfortunate things about the way politics is practiced in the 2020s is I have to explain to my students something I didn't have to do when I first began teaching. I have to explain to them not to take the term saints and sinners literally. They come with quotation marks around them. And I remind them that just because someone selects a different candidate or joins a different party than me doesn't make them immoral or stupid or evil. Odds are they're a good, decent, kind person who simply just has a different idea about how our community or our society ought to solve the problems and the challenges we face. And of course, one person's saint is another sinner anyway. And I don't know about all of you, but I have plenty in my family. My dad and my stepmom, they're progressives. I don't have the nerve to ask him, I think my dad thinks that Bernie Sanders is too conservative. I know. I grew up in that house. My Uncle Kerry, on the other hand, and my Aunt Susie, they are arch conservatives. And I think, but I don't have the nerve to ask them either, I think they think that President Trump is too liberal. Guess who gets to sit in between my dad and my Uncle Kerry at Thanksgiving every year? That would be me. I bring the striped shirt and the whistle. And I wonder how much nicer my life would be if Election Day and Thanksgiving Day weren't so close on the calendar. If they had more than 2.5 weeks to calm down, life would be much, much better. But anyway, I digress. So there are saints that are roughly 40% of the electorate. These are voters who, like I said, are going to vote for my party and my candidates almost no matter what. 40% who are, quote unquote, sinners. Not bad people, but people who will never vote for my party or my candidate. And one question I'd ask you to consider, and we can talk about it later if you like, is why so many of us, particularly in the political realm, devote so much time to trying to convince people we know will never change their mind. I've been walking across college campuses for many years. I walk past the tables where the college Democrats are and where the college Republicans are. You know what I've never, ever seen? Not once. I've never seen one young person say to the other, oh my goodness, you're right. I was wrong. I never thought of it that way. Thank you for enlightening me. No, they just go back and forth, but we still do it. And the question, again, just file away for now, is why is it that we devote so much time to trying to convince people that we know we can't? I watched my dad and my uncle going at it for my entire lifetime, and they're no closer to convincing them. I think they're further away from it than they were when I first started listening. But we do it anyway. But if 40% of the voters are quote unquote saints, if 40% of the voters are quote unquote sinners, that means that 20% of the electorate are what we'll call salvageable. And these are voters who, depending on the circumstance, have displayed a willingness to vote for candidates of either party in past elections. And we can talk a little bit later about the various salvageable groups that will decide this election. But what I'll tell you right now, just to put a bookmark in that part of the conversation, is the single most important salvageable demographic voter group in America today. Does anyone know? Does anyone want to take a guess? Youth? No, absolutely not. Undecideds? Undecideds are definitely salvageable, but let's think about this in terms of a demographic group. What do you think? Baby boomers? You're getting closer. Okay. You know what I've realized is indigent. You're going to save me on this one. Okay. We prefer the term women of a certain age, but okay. And I do put that on, and I put that on the midterm just because I think it's important for the students to know that right away. I'm sorry? Oh, yes. Well, I'm going to get even more specific than that, but you're heading on the right track. So thank you for help, for bringing us along. The single most important salvageable voter group in American politics today and for the last many years are married women. Are married women. So on the off chance that there are any married women in the group today, when you tell your kids that you're the most important person in the world, well, this November, you're exactly right. And I'm going to talk for just a minute about why that is. Oh, you were going to make a point? I'm sorry? Well, not every married woman is a salvageable, but a larger percentage of them tend to be, and this is the reason why. You've all probably read in the past about the so-called gender gap in politics. All other things considered equal, and I want to emphasize that phrase, all other things considered equal, a female voter is much more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate than a Republican. And all things considered equal, a male voter is much more likely to vote for a Republican than Democrat. And I'd say probably since the age of Reagan, this gender gap has characterized our politics. But what gets a lot less attention, the news media pays much less attention to, is an equally broad gap in our politics than the gender gap, and that's the marriage gap. And again, all other things considered equal, which isn't always the case, a married voter is much more likely to vote Republican than a Democrat. And a single voter is much more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. Now, there's exceptions to this rule, of course. My dad and stepmom are married. I have plenty of single people who are conservative. But these are, but in terms of broader trends, this gender gap and this marriage gap, therefore leave us at the risk of overwhelmingly oversimplifying the discussion, leaves us with four basic cohorts, four basic voter groups in the electorate. So the most conservative group in the electorate are married men. They vote overwhelmingly Republican. And I see a lot of nodding heads here, so, okay. The most liberal group, the most progressive group in the electorate by far, are single women. My teaching assistant this semester at Pepperdine is a young single man, and he is very conservative. And he has come to the conclusion that he can't date during election years because so many single women lean in the other direction. Single men, look, I used to be a single man for a lot of years, so I'm not putting anybody else down but myself. The single men, if married men are over here to the right, single women are over here to the left. Single men, well, they're out there somewhere. For any of you who have sons who aren't married, you know exactly what I'm talking about, correct? We don't know if they're watching cable TV or what they're watching on cable TV. We don't know if they're spending too much time on the computer. All we know is that they vote in smaller numbers than any of these other groups. So if married men are over here and single women are over there and single men are out there somewhere, married women decide elections. And when the majority of married women vote on issues that reflect primarily their marital status, they tend to elect Republicans to office. And when they vote on issues that typically, in a secular society, tend to reflect their gender-based interests, they tend to elect Democrats. So once again, the next time somebody at home doubts you on whether you're the most important person in the world or not, tell them that you heard it from me. So, but I want to get back to that strategic challenge we face. A campaign, in order to win, has to motivate saints. Those saints are already on my side. I don't have to convince them of anything. I just have to motivate them. I have to remind them why they're on my side. And I want to excite them and inspire them so they turn out to vote. Salvageables, I need to persuade them. I need to convince them that this is one of those elections where my side makes more sense. And as all of you know, not just from academics, from work, from home, motivating someone to do something is a much different communications challenge than persuading them to do something. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Vanessa and I were going to take everybody out to lunch after we finish here today. We're not, but let's just pretend, okay? And I were to tell you, I know this great restaurant out in the San Fernando Valley. It's excellent. You probably have to wait for a table. It's pretty expensive. It's going to take about an hour or so to get there, but trust me, it's really good. I might be able to persuade you to go there. But Vanessa, on the other hand, says, remember the last time we went to lunch, we went to that wonderful place right here in Palisades. Remember how good that was and how much we all enjoyed it? It's a much easier sell because she's motivating you rather than persuading you. And one of the reasons our politics has become so divided in the modern era is because candidates and campaign workers on both sides have realized motivating somebody who already agrees with you is a lot easier and a lot faster than persuading someone who's undecided. So what campaigns do, what both parties do, is they look for issues where their saints and the salvageables are on the same side. Because then they can talk to both of those groups and motivate one group and persuade the other with the same message. And I will argue to you, I'll suggest to you, that there are two issues in this election, more than any other, that will ultimately define the outcome. Because both parties see an issue on which their saints and salvageables are united. And those are the issues that they're going to emphasize in this campaign all the way till Election Day. Republicans understand, and there's plenty of polling data to back this up, Republicans understand that the issue of immigration is one of those rare issues on which their loyal supporters and salvageable swing voters, those in the political center, are largely in agreement. And at this point in American history, I would say that the majority of the electorate, from the conservatives through most moderates and independents, tend to favor what we'll just call it a more restrictionist approach to immigration policy. And over the years, that debate has gone back and forth, and we can talk more later, if you like, about why that's the case in America today. But polls show pretty conclusively that efforts to strengthen a presence at the border and other efforts to discourage individuals from coming here, particularly without documentation, is something that enjoys wide public support. And that's something that unites Republican saints and salvageables. So it's something that Republicans are going to talk about quite a bit. And Democrats are going to try to find ways not to talk about unless they have to. On the flip side, and I want to be very respectful here, again, because I'm not here as an advocate, I'm here as an analyst. An issue, particularly over the last 2 years, that has worked effectively for Democrats the same way that the issue of immigration has for Republicans is the issue of abortion. And since the Dobbs decision in 2022, we've seen public opinion polling shift in a notable way, that in which Democratic loyalists and salvageable voters tend to be in agreement. So when Republicans from Trump on down are out on the campaign trail, they want to talk about immigration as much as they can because it can motivate and persuade at the same time. And when Democrats are out on the campaign trail from Biden on down, they want to talk about abortion as much as they can because they know it's one that unites their base with the voters in the political center. Now, the challenge for both sides is they have to convince voters that their issue is the most important one. And what they also have to do at the same time is try to reassure salvageables that even if you may happen to disagree with me on one of those issues, you shouldn't get all that too upset about it. So that's why you saw President Trump on Monday make his announcement in which he said that he no longer supported a nationwide ban on abortion, but felt it should be left to the states because he realized that a lot of salvageables, particularly married women, would find that more ambitious agenda to be much more difficult for them. And it's the same reason that the White House is getting ready to announce, wow, I didn't even tell you what the White House was about to do, and they're already watching me. That's a little bit unnerving. um, in the next several days, President Biden is getting ready to announce a much more stringent border policy as it relates to individuals seeking asylum coming to this country. Because like Trump on abortion, he knows he can't win that issue, but needs to convince those salvageable voters not to worry about it as much is the issue that works to his benefit. So as this election goes forward, there's a lot of things to pay attention to. One of the mixed blessings of a digital era is there's more news than any of us could have ever fathomed there was about an election. I feel like the phrase drinking from a fire hose doesn't even do justice what it's like trying to keep up with political news online. There was a great commercial several years ago in the early years of the internet era. Most of you aren't old enough to remember it, but I'll tell you about it anyway. In which there's a man sitting at a computer and a little pop-up comes on the screen and it says, "Congratulations, you have reached the end of the internet." And my wife accuses me of striving to try to find the end of the internet. I'm never going to get there because there's always more news. There's always more information, right? But so as you try to navigate, as you try to swim through that ocean of information about the election, watch these two issues, not just as advocates, because I know every one of us has very strong opinions about these two issues. Watch the way these two issues are being discussed, not just as an advocate with strong opinions on both of them for yourself, but watch the way the campaigns talk about them. Because the campaigns are very rarely about changing a voter's mind. If there is a voter in the United States of America who's going to change their mind on either one of those two issues between now and November, I'd like to meet them because I think it's pretty unlikely. Rather, what a campaign is about is convincing voters that the issues on which you and I agree are the ones on which you should vote, not the issues on which you disagree. So watch how the two candidates, watch how the two parties talk about these two issues. And when there's too much noise and too much information flowing around, keep your eye on those two discussions. And that's going to help you navigate the election going through until Election Day. And we can come back to all of this in just a little bit if you like. But what I want to do for just a few minutes, like I said earlier, is talk a little bit about how we got here. Here we sit at an incredibly divided time in American history. And it's not just our politics that are divided, our culture, our society. So how did we get here? How did we get to a place where I have to remind my students that the terms saints and sinners need to have quotation marks around them and that they shouldn't be taken literally because unhappily, too many of their parents do take those terms literally. So how did we get here? Well, I have a theory. I'm going to try it out, and then you can tell me whether it makes sense or not. So for most of the second half of American history, I'd say from the Civil War on, for most of American history, the single most reliable indicator on partisan voting behavior, the issue that would give the greatest indication whether someone would vote Democrat or Republican or not, was income. The more money an individual made, the more likely they were to vote Republican. The less money they made, they were more likely to vote Democrat. And that was the case, that's been the case throughout the entire era of the two-party system. So literally from the Civil War forward for roughly 100 years. And in the 1960s, a time of tumult, we began to see a little bit of change in that taking place. And we began to see voters on both sides, both liberal and conservative, while still prioritizing economic issues, also beginning to integrate social and cultural matters into their voting decisions. And Presidents Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter both began to reach out to the other party's saints, not on economic, but on cultural matters. And then in the 1990s, this trend really accelerated. So for those of you either with long memories or who studied political history, you may remember in the early 1990s a term that emerged to describe a particular group of voters, even more specific than the married women we were talking about earlier. Does anyone remember the term soccer moms? Of course. Okay. Smart people. So a soccer mom, as all of you'd be able to point out, a soccer mom back in that era was a stereotype for a married suburban woman who, as the stereotype goes, would drive her children to soccer practice in her minivan. And to be fair, even though there were a lot more soccer moms, there were soccer dads too. My dad, the Bernie guy, he was a soccer dad. And several smart Democrats, most notably Bill Clinton, but others as well, began reaching out to these suburban voters, soccer moms and soccer dads, voters who were economically successful and therefore more economically conservative, who voted Republican for most of their adult lives. And what Clinton and Dianne Feinstein and other Democrats said is, we're not those old style tax and spend Democrats, the kind that Dan Schnur's dad likes so much. We're a new breed of Democrats. We're more responsible. You can trust us with your tax dollars. But what you can do now, because you soccer parents, while you're very conservative on economic issues, many of you are more moderate and some of you have been more liberal on social and cultural matters, on issues like gun control, on issues like abortion, on issues like environmental protection. And what those Democrats did, starting in the 1990s, is they began to move a whole bunch of Republican saints over the Democratic side by convincing them that those social and cultural issues should be the matters on which they cast their vote. Well, Republicans didn't just take this lying down. A bunch of smart Republicans, Karl Rove and Newt Gingrich and others, they began reaching out to another salvageable cohort. Didn't get quite as well known as soccer moms. There's another term that emerged in that era: NASCAR dads. And just like a soccer mom drove their kids to soccer practice in the minivan, NASCAR dads took their families to see NASCAR races in the pickup truck. Two overly broad and sometimes unfair stereotypes, but just stick with me on this for another minute. And NASCAR dads and NASCAR moms were the exact opposite of the soccer parents. These are voters who were economically working class, who were blue collar. And they had always voted Democrat because they were economically progressive. But many of them tended to be more culturally conservative on issues like guns, on issues like life. And ultimately what happened is the two parties engineered this massive trade: soccer moms for NASCAR dads. And the ultimate result, numerically, statistically, was pretty much of a dead even draw. But it reconfigured our politics and it reconfigured our society. Because what it meant is that no longer was the most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior income. Rather, by the 2004 election, when George W. Bush defeated John Kerry, by 2004, the most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior was what the political scientists call religiosity. And religiosity is not the religious faith that you practice, but rather the commitment with which you practice it. And what we saw in 2004 is that a voter who attended church or synagogue once a week or more was 3 times as likely to vote for George Bush as they were for John Kerry. And a voter who went to religious services once a month or less, and I don't judge other people, everyone makes their own decisions on what makes sense for them in their lives, but those who attend religious services once a month or less were just as likely, more likely, to vote Democrat than Republican. And as time passed, other cultural differentiators began to emerge. Most notably in our society, a growing divide between voters who lived in urban America and who lived in rural America. So what's the difference between an economic disagreement and a cultural or a social disagreement? I would argue to you that an economic disagreement is a much easier one to negotiate. If Desiree wants to cut taxes by 5% and I want to cut them by 7%, we cut them by 6%. If she wants to increase education spending by 3% and I want to increase education spending by 8%, well, I find someone who's better at math than me And what I'm told is we increase education spending by 5.5%. Split the difference. But on issues like gun ownership, on issues like abortion, on issues like same-sex marriage, it's a lot harder to find that common ground. And I want to make this clear. I'm not saying it can't be done. What I'm saying is it's more difficult. It can be done. And people of goodwill can disagree and still find ways to work together. The famous quote from Ronald Reagan, he said, "Someone who disagrees with me 20% of the time isn't my enemy. He's someone who agrees with me 80% of the time." In the coda that I offer my students is I tell them someone who disagrees with me 80% of the time isn't my enemy either. She's someone I can work with 20% of the time. We can still get a lot done, but we got to work a lot harder to find that 20%. And in our country, in our society today, the incentive to find that common ground with those with whom we disagree isn't nearly as strong as it once was. As a famous sociologist, a man by the name of Robert Putnam, and for those of you who have not read his famous book from the end of the 20th century, he wrote a terrific book called Bowling Alone. And he talked about how the societal and cultural ties in our society have weakened in modern times. Now, keep in mind, this is at the dawn of the internet era. It's before social media ever existed. And already what he was saying then, even in the late 90s, is he was talking about how advances in technology, for all the economic and cultural and social benefits that it brought us, also created more of a disincentive for us to reach out to each other. And the example he gave is he talked about barn raisings. Now, I grew up in the 20th century. The only thing I know about barn raisings is what I learned on Little House on the Prairie. But what Putnam talked about in his program, in his book, and what some of us have learned elsewhere, is when the West was settled, when a new family would move into a homestead, all the families would come from miles around to help them raise their barn to put it together because one family just couldn't do that for themselves. And that created community and social and cultural ties because we helped each other. Well, I don't know about you, but the last time we moved into our house 11, 12 years ago. Actually, I used to live just a few blocks from here, so thank you for bringing me back to my old neighborhood. When we moved into our new house back in 2012, 2013, whatever it was, we met some of our neighbors, but we didn't need them to move in. And so our relationships with them are strong, but not as strong as they once were because that mutual reliance is now optional rather than required. To me, one of the greatest things about faith, any faith, is it creates that understanding of mutual reliance and how we all benefit. But in a technologically driven society, that's an option, not a requirement. And it becomes much easier for us to isolate. And while I am not a technophobe, while I'm not a druid, while I believe that all sorts of extraordinary advances and benefits come from advances in communications technology, the downside is that while those advances in digital and social media, while on one hand, those advances have empowered us to have our voices heard, on the other hand, they've isolated us. When I was growing up back in the 20th century, my dad, my Uncle Carrie, and I would watch the evening news. And we would come to dramatically different opinions about what we saw in the news, but at least we're drinking from the same pool of information. Today, Carrie watches Fox, Dad watches MSNBC, and they're not just intaking two different news products, they're experiencing two entirely different versions of reality. And of course, once you go online, it's the easiest thing in the world to find an informational cul-de-sac. And to be fair to us, it's sort of human nature. It's human nature to want to talk to and listen to and learn from the smartest people in the world. Who are the smartest people in the world? Well, they're the people who agree with me. And whether I find those people on Fox or MSNBC, either way, I can create an online community where no one ever disagrees with me, where no one ever challenges me, where my opinion is only reinforced and I am congratulated for being so smart to have that opinion. And that makes it easier for us to isolate and think about somebody who votes for another candidate who has the nerve to belong to another party, and think of them as a sinner without the quotation marks. So I feel like this shift, aided but not caused by digital technology, this shift in the issues that we prioritize in our politics has created these divisions. The challenge, it seems to me, is how we, particularly people of faith, can remind each other, remind ourselves the benefits we realize from reaching out to those with whom we disagree. I don't have to convince that person with whom I disagree that I'm right and they're wrong. They don't have to convince me. But if I listen to them, I can learn something important. I can learn something valuable, even if it doesn't change my mind. And it can give me some insight into them that even if you and I disagree, I have an understanding of why you and I disagree. And that means we can still respect each other even if we disagree. And it means that we can look for opportunities to work together on those issues where there is potential for agreement. This is why I'm such an incredible believer in Generation Z. People ask me why I can stay so optimistic about the world. Gaza, Ukraine, China, how can I stay so optimistic? And I'll tell you I'm optimistic because every week I get to spend time with some of the most amazing young people on the planet Earth. But here's what I know about Gen Z. I know two things about them, one of which is to discourage you and one of which is going to make you feel a little bit better. One thing we know about Generation Z, one thing we know about the youngest generation of voters in America today, is that they vote in much smaller numbers than any other generation in America today. They have consciously opted out of the political process, and those young people who are just as civic-minded as those I had in my first classes a zillion years ago simply find other ways to exhibit their civic engagement rather than voting. Because this same generation, the same age cohort, while they vote in smaller numbers than the rest of us, they also volunteer their time back into their communities at greater levels than any other generation in America today or in recent American history. It's wonderful. You should applaud them. That's where we tell everybody else that we applauded them behind their back? Okay, because we don't always tell them to their face. But the reason that gives me such hope is, first of all, I make it clear to them every school, every semester, that I want them to vote, that they need to vote. And I tell them, look, volunteering is admirable, volunteering is noble, but you can only clean up so many parks. You can only bring so many meals to so many seniors. If you want to make change, you got to step inside the gates too. And it can't be an either or. What more and more of these young people tell me is they say, hey, look, at the end of the day on a Saturday, I have a clean park. What do you have in Washington or in Sacramento or at City Hall? And so it becomes harder and harder to argue. But here's what I see from their volunteering. When they volunteer in a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or at a community watch or neighborhood cleanup, they volunteer with people who care about their community, but who don't necessarily agree with them on all the issues. I see young people who are both advocates for gun control and gun ownership, working together to make sure that the seniors in their community are fed. I see those young people who believe abortion should be legal and those who think it should be not, working together to teach at-risk children to read. And they learn every day as they're volunteering that just because someone's part of it, or registered for another party or votes for another candidate, doesn't make them a sinner. They're a saint too, even if we don't agree on everything. So it seems to me our task, for the few of you in this room who are not Gen Z or millennials, it's our job, it's our obligation to help make it as easy as possible for them to lead us forward. We all learned a long time ago that a child shall lead us. And children, which they don't like being called once they get to be Generation Z, I recognize that. They have figured out something that many in our generation have lost, which is we don't have to agree on everything in order to work together. And to me, one of the powers of programs like these, far above and beyond whatever factual information you may take away from a guest lecturer who's privileged enough to come and talk to you, The greatest value of gatherings like these throughout the Southland, throughout California, throughout America, are when people are willing to sit down with each other without imposing a litmus test first. Say, we can learn together, we can work together. And if we happen to disagree, that's a fascinating opportunity for conversation, not a brick wall to divide us. So how do we solve this divide? How do we build that bridge? We set an example. We keep doing what you keep doing what you're doing and do more of it. And remind the people that you care about, not only do the benefits that come from society from this kind of cooperative effort, but the kind of benefits that come within from being willing to participate in this way. So it is a challenging time, but it's not unique. And yes, I am wrapping up, don't worry, Vanessa, and then we'll get to questions. This isn't a unique time. We've had divisions like these in our country since before we were a country. And every single time, not just presidents, not just famous leaders, but improbable heroes, just everyday women and men saying, I'm going to play my little part in healing this breach. There's a wonderful quote from the late Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computers. He gave a famous commencement speech at Stanford University many years ago. You're nodding, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you may remember in the speech, he used an incredible phrase. He talked about putting a dent in the universe. And I love that phrase. I absolutely adore that phrase. And I'll tell you why. Because when you're young and ambitious, you think you can change the world, right? And then as you get older, you realize changing the world isn't that easy. The world's a big place. It's a complicated task. So as you move forward, you realize, okay, maybe I'm not going to change the world. Maybe I'm not going to boil the ocean. But as Jobs said, maybe I'm just going to pick out one spot and I put a little bit of X on it. And I'm going to pick up a crowbar and I'm going to put a dent in the universe in that one spot. And to me, what's so wonderful about that concept is that if every one of us puts a dent in the universe, we do change the world. So before I get too carried away with myself, I'm going to admit something to you very quickly. I had the chance several years ago to meet Steve Jobs' widow, Lorraine Powell Jobs. A phenomenal, fascinating meeting. And at the end of it, just as we were finishing up, I said, Ms. Jobs, I have one other question to ask you that's not related to the topic of our meeting at all, but would you be willing to indulge me for another minute? And she said, of course. And I talked to her about her late husband's commencement speech and the phrase putting a dent in the universe and how much it had meant to me and how I passed it on to my students every year. And she started laughing. I thought, okay, that wasn't meant to be funny. Why is she laughing at me? She says, well, Dan, that's lovely. She said, I have to admit something to you. I don't know this for a fact because Steve and I never talked about it, but I knew him pretty well. I do remember that phrase, that speech. I do remember that phrase. She goes, I don't think that's what he meant by it. She said, but I love what you've done with it. So as long as you don't credit the idea to him and just the quote, go for it. So that's the Steve Jobs, Dan Schnur comparison. And I do think, bringing this all to a close, is that needs to be our goal. Politically, spiritually, in every aspect of our lives. As we put a dent in the universe. And together we change the world. And at the times when it seems most hopeless, when the two candidates are talking to each other about each other in ways that would make a grown man blush, when absolute tragedy is happening in far too many places throughout our country and throughout our world, when it's the easiest to get discouraged and be tempted to give up, that's when it's most important to set the example. And for each one of us to just put one dent so together we can change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to open it up with questions. I'll pitch one out to you first. And then ladies, if you do have a question, wait for the microphone to come around just so we can make sure that we pick that up. I appreciate what you said about the sinners and the saints. And I know so much of kind of what pulls people are the faces, right? So it isn't oftentimes the Republicans or the Democrats. It's Biden, it's Trump, and the people are what we see often beyond what many people in that party are representing and doing. So I've heard it said, maybe don't vote for the candidate, vote for what that candidate's group can do. I'd love to hear kind of your response to beyond the candidate thinking.
All right, well, so let's start with an unspoken, not just an unspoken truth, an unspoken fact. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are the two least popular presidential nominees in our country's history. And part of that is their fault. Part of that is our fault. Because as we become such a partisan, divided, and polarized society, half of us automatically register disapproval for the candidate representing the other side. But we know this in every aspect of our lives. Just like love is contagious, so is hatred. And when we are exposed on a regular basis to that kind of venom in the public square, it becomes really, really easy to say, well, they're both horrible. They're both jerks. I can't handle either of them. I would argue to you, and I hope I don't offend anyone, that this is largely the fuel behind Robert F. Kennedy's campaign. People are so unhappy with both of these candidates that they're looking for some other alternative, any other alternative. But what this landscape has done is it's actually driven me, at least personally, Vanessa, in a different direction. Because for a while I thought to myself, all right, in a candidate where I'm choosing between the lesser of two evils, again, have you ever heard, I'm not changing the subject, so I just want to let you know, have any of you ever heard the old joke about the two guys at on the campsite when the bear shows up? Okay, two guys out camping. A bear wanders into the campsite. One of the two guys starts to panic, just starts to completely freak out. Oh my gosh, we're done for. The other guy very calmly starts to lace on his sneakers. And his friend says, what are you, crazy? You can't outrun that bear. And the second guy says, yeah, but I can outrun you. I feel like that's the way far too many campaigns take place these days, where we vote for the tallest jockey at the track because that's the best of the alternatives available. So for a long time, I thought to myself, well, I might not hold either of these individuals in particularly high regard themselves, but I'm going to look at their issue positions. And if one of them is more likely to implement policy that I like than the other, then I'll vote for that person. And I have to admit, this is not me suggesting it's what you should do, but it's what I've done. In the last few years, I've actually reversed that. I've decided I would rather have an elected official with whom I don't agree on many issues. Now, there are some, and for every one of us, it's different. There are some issues we hold close enough to our hearts that we can't compromise on, and that's okay. But for the most part, what I've begun to do more and more is look for a man or a woman whose character I can respect. And to say at some point during their 2 years or 4 years or 6 years in office, they're going to face a challenge, they're going to face a crisis that we can't envision right now. And I want someone who I can trust as an individual, someone with the strength of character, to conduct themselves in a responsible and honorable way when they face that challenge. And if we don't happen to agree on charter schools or on the research or development tax credit, well, that's not perfect. But I'd rather try to compromise on public policy than compromise on character and leadership. And so that's where I've come. And I don't know if that's just a rationalization for what politics is today, or, at least in my mind, it's a reminder that I want a man or woman to lead us who I can trust, who I can believe in. And if they sometimes come to different conclusions than I do, that's a price I'm willing to pay to have a person of honor leading us forward. I'm also very capable of giving shorter answers to questions, but that was a really, really good one. So,
from that because it's very important. I had the same idea about the character of the leadership, and I'm still able to work with some people who have different views than me, and I like to listen, to learn. And so I asked a question, and one of the things that I asked was, and I'm a psychologist, and so are they. And so I said, as a psychologist and as a woman, would you marry, I'm sorry, Trump? I mean, as a character. And she's saying, no, but then doesn't change. So the motivation, I'm missing the motivation, to stimulate, because I try with a motivation with a character, which I think is a very good point, because you lead by what you are. But how do you have these people that would not marry someone, meaning that they don't respect that person? And I don't mean literally marry, but to agree with a character, that would go for their belief in the situation, I mean, in their policy, but not the person.
So I'm going to respond by offering you some data, which I realize is cowardly, but it'll at least get the conversation going. The Pew Research Center, which does, I think, the most reliable polling, not just on political, but on societal issues in the country today. They did a poll recently where they asked Americans if they would be comfortable with their daughter or son marrying someone from a different race or religion. And the results I found not just encouraging, but inspiring. More than 90% of Americans, the largest number, not just in our country's history, but in human history, said that that's something they would be comfortable with their child making that kind of decision. Then Pew asked the same respondents, would you be comfortable with your daughter or son marrying someone of the opposite political party? And the numbers is, I'll guess, I can tell by the way you're laughing, we're at an all-time low. So look, we are a tribal species, and we have been since prehistoric days. We cluster into bands at that time for mutual protection. Now I say for mutual psychological protection. And part of being tribal is the least scrupulous of our leaders tend to frighten us about people who aren't in our tribe. The others, them. Ben Sass, the president of the University of Florida, the former United States Senator, wrote a wonderful book that I'd strongly recommend that I assigned to my classes at Pepperdine, simply called Them. And it's about the otherizing of society. And we have made such progress, not enough, but we've made such progress in so many areas of that otherizing. When so many parents say that their child's happiness is much more important than a racial or an ethnic or religious difference, that's to me a wonderful victory in the fight against otherizing. But even if through most of human history we define the other as someone who didn't look like us or didn't talk like us, now more and more we define the other as someone who doesn't think like us. And we demonize them and marginalize them in much the same way. Sass has a great line in his book, and you use Trump as an example. I'm going to very consciously not, because I don't want to take sides here. And neither does Sass. Sass uses a term called nut picking, not nitpicking, nut picking. And he says, what we do in both parties is we pick out the nuts on the other side. The nuttiest, freakiest, most outlandish, most ridiculous voice over on the other, most extreme voice over on the other side. Say, I can't work with those others because look at that freak over there. Look what he said. Look what he did. And what Sass then points out is both parties have more than their share of nuts. But both parties also have some really smart, principled people with whom we disagree. And what I'll tell my class next Tuesday after they take their final is I'm going to tell them, I'm going to give you one last assignment this semester. And it's the most important assignment I've given you all year long. And what really frustrates me, but there's no way around it, is I can't grade it. So you're gonna have to do this assignment on your own without me. Here's the assignment. I want every principled conservative in this room to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. And I want every principled progressive in this room to read George Will or Bret Stephens or Ross Douthat once a week. I'm not trying to make you change. I'm not trying to make you change your mind. I'm not even trying to make you open your mind. I'm just trying to remind you that along with the nuts, there's really smart people over there. However you define the over there. And listening and learning from them can be a very valuable exercise, whether you change your mind or not. So when someone says that they would never, quote unquote, marry Trump or Biden, literally, of course, that's okay, because we have laws in this country about how many people can marry the same person anyway. But obviously, you meant the term metaphorically. My point, I guess my point would be, don't obsess about him or her, about Trump or Biden or Hillary or whoever it happens to be. There's smart people over there too. And quote unquote, intellectually, marry them instead. Because what I've learned in my real marriage is I can learn an immense amount from somebody with whom I disagree.
But when someone, I don't know, it's like what you are saying. I mean, it's very difficult to change the moral of someone.
Well, I think changing
And
someone's
that's-
morals is a pretty big ask.
Yeah.
I would lower the bar a little bit.
Well, not to change them, but to, like you said, open their mind to. And one thing that I observe, I mean, I came to America as a foreigner, and one of the things that I loved, and it was 1980s, I loved the unification of because I was in France, and in France we are very, freedom, and that's the most important. So but America was the unification of the American. And I feel that this is not there. The fiber is as disintegrated. And when you are talking, I think that's what the young Z generation feel, is that that's the reason they go on little, what they can achieve, because they feel that they have no way of changing that political system. And people are getting older and older in the political system to be able to reach the level. You mentioned Kennedy, not Robert Kennedy, but
yeah,
he was a young, or Clinton, they were younger people, and he gave a hope. And I don't think that's happening right now. I think one of the things that disappeared is hope.
Well, I think my own opinion is I believe these things happen in cycles.
Okay, yeah.
And at a more specific level, every presidential election is an overreaction against the incumbent. And you can look back at the last, you can look back through the modern political era on this. By the way, a student will always ask me whenever I use the term modern political era to define it for them. And I tell them, I said, okay, the modern political era began on July 31st, 1963. That's the day that I was born. Everything that happened before that was prehistoric. Everything that happened after that was modern. But if you look back through it, as odd as it seems, Dwight Eisenhower, who retired when he was in his 60s, was seen as sort of an elderly presence, and he was replaced by John F. Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson presided over a time of great social unrest, so we elected a law and order president in Nixon. After Watergate, we elected a moralist in Carter. After Carter, we elected a more expansive visionist in Reagan. After Bush, who was seen, I think, somewhat unfairly as someone who was detached from the lives of everyday Americans, we elected an empath in Bill Clinton. And you can take this every step of the way. And I would argue to you that in the aftermath of a presidential election between not just the two least popular, but the two oldest nominees in American history, I gave up making political predictions forever in November of 2016, but I will make you this prediction. Not only will I predict, this would be a cop-out to say we'll have younger nominees in 2028 because we almost have to. Otherwise, there's this whole assisted living thing we're going to have to figure out. ramps, but I would suspect that, as was the case with Kennedy and with Clinton and with Theodore Roosevelt, we will see a next generation emerge. So on the very specific question of age, I think that's the overreaction we'll see 4 years from now. I'm sorry?
What else would you suspect would happen in terms of the overcompensation?
The other, and I'm less confident that this will happen in 2028, but the other sort of correction I believe will happen in the not too distant future is, just like these other factors happen in cycles, so do these divisions. In addition to Sass's book, Them, in fairness, I assign a book from a conservative former senator. I also assign a similar book from a liberal columnist, Ezra Klein of the New York Times, called Why We're Polarized. And in Klein's book, he talks about how in the 1950s, the American Association of Political Scientists, and yes, that's a real organization, and yes, their conventions are just as boring as it sounds like they would be. But in the 1950s, the American Association of Political Scientists came to a conclusion that the single greatest threat to our democracy in that era was that the two parties were too similar, and that Americans were being deprived of a legitimate choice, a set of alternatives between the two. So the fact that we are such a divided and polarized society today isn't a necessity. I think it happens I think it will happen in cycles. And whether it's 2028 or 2032 or whenever it is, I think at a certain point, Americans, particularly Generation Z, who are already opting out of traditional politics, will say, I'm exhausted. I don't want politics like this anymore. And so I think that will be the next course correction we see after age.
Hi, I'm Beverly, and it's nice to meet you. I am one
Oh,
of the,
by the way, Beverly, thank you for the reminder, because the first two questioners didn't. I'll ask you the same thing as I do when I speak on campus. If each of you could tell me your name and your major, that would be very helpful.
my major was English literature at Berkeley,
Okay.
and I have a lot to say, but the main thing is when I engage in conversations with my friends on both sides of the aisle, and when they say this country is so divided, I said, well, I don't feel divided. I'm an American, you know, and I think that we as Americans should stick together, because there are worse problems like communism, and the people who come from communist countries will tell us that what's happening in America is how the communists come into power, and that is they divide you by class, by race, by, you know, socioeconomic class. So again, and I want you to tweak my sales pitch with my friends, but it really is to engage. I love to talk to people with whom I disagree, because maybe I'll change my mind. But the three things that I get people to agree on is, I say, I am whoever I vote for. I believe in law and order. I believe that we should not have open borders. We should have a policy for immigrants. I'm not against immigration. And three, I'm for a strong economy and jobs for especially the middle class in America. And I don't have anybody disagree with me. And so that's how I engage in a conversation with people who are on the left and the right. But again, my main argument is we're all Americans, and I'm in my 70s, so I've seen many elections, and sometimes it goes left, sometimes it goes right. Pretty much it's sort of middle of the road, but you know, a little left, a little right, you know, amazingly, I'm still here. We're still America, and we're still, you know, voting. So that's I was a salesperson for IBM. So I'm always looking for, you know, how can we have a conversation? And that's how I do it, because we have a lot as Americans to agree upon, then we have to disagree, especially when you're looking at other countries. Do we want to be not America, where sometimes it goes here this way and that way, and the pendulum goes back and forth? And it's okay. But I do find that people get so emotional about things not going their way that, that's not the America that I grew up in. And as a graduate of Berkeley, I don't remember feeling swayed to believe a certain way. I pride myself in being an independent thinker. And at Berkeley, I don't think the professors tried to make me left. I mean, anything. I was who I was.
That is a more modern phenomenon, no question about it.
Okay. And, but I would like, my question is, how can I tweak my conversation? And I don't back away from a conversation. If anybody opens up the door to have a conversation, especially about politics or religion, I'm there. I don't shy away, from a discussion.
Okay, so first we're going to clone you.
Okay.
Okay. See, I told you that technology has its good points. I'd offer a couple thoughts. One, the way you're talking. There's a wonderful quote from Dwight Eisenhower, of all people. Eisenhower said, "If you can't solve a problem, enlarge it." And the way I've always framed it for my classes, I say, if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. Because most seemingly unsolvable problems seem like they're unsolvable because you're looking at them in a very narrow binary way, left or right, up or down, yes or no. And when you take a step back and talk about these very divisive questions in a broader context, you remind people that in fact there is opportunity for agreement. Since you did corporate communications, you may be familiar with the negotiating term, go to the balcony. Whenever you're stuck in really difficult, tight negotiations, say you're on stage, you're in the middle of a very dramatic scene, go up to the balcony and take a look at it from a broader perspective. And different avenues open up for potential solution. And I love that that's not only what you do, but that's what you remind people. So I'll go back to what I said earlier, keep doing what you're doing and just do it more. Okay, but I will say this. It was interesting that you began that conversation by contrasting the US with the old Soviet Union. And in my mind, it's not a coincidence that it was the 1950s when those political scientists were their two parties were too similar. Because what heals divisions? An external threat. What gets me to set aside the differences between my tribe and the tribe next to me is when that other tribe from the other side of the hill comes and threatens us. They call it the Mars attacks school of politics. What can bring all the countries of the world together? Well, when Martians invade, of course, we'll all come together in order to repel that foreign menace. And too often, the way these cycles have manifested themselves is when our country has faced an external threat. And in the 1950s, when this study was done, it was only a few years after the end of the Second World War, and it was at the height of the concerns about the Cold War. And so our differences didn't seem as big in that context. So the question, to me, the challenge, and I don't think it's an unsolvable one, but it is a challenge, is how can you create that sense of common threat or common goal without it needing to be a military one? And you're taking the very first important steps in that direction. And I think it gets back to what we talked about earlier, reminding people that you might want to cut taxes by 3% and I might want to cut them by 6%. Let's split the difference and work on our bigger goals on which we are united. It's obviously much easier to say than to do, but I believe that not just politics, but I believe that society is simply a series of concentric circles. When I want to win an election, I start with that innermost cycle and I gradually work outward. And on more ethereal, spiritual concepts like the ones you're talking about, same thing. You start with a group of about 20 really, really smart women, and then you build outward from there.
Aliyah, my background is in dispute resolution.
Wow.
Yeah, so my question is a bit related to that, so I hope it won't be very difficult to answer it. But I think you've touched a bit on it on an individual level by stepping back when things are getting very emotional, and by externally creating a common threat but there's that range in the middle. So my question, my personal opinion, it's just an opinion. The problem is not with disagreeing, it's with the approach of which we disagree. I think this is what creates divisions. So do you think the government or even the civil society can do anything to alter or to impact the way people disagree without using non-democratic means?
Yes and no. How's that for a waffle answer? But let me elaborate. I think what your point is exactly the right one. And Vanessa, if I may, I don't think you need a guest speaker for your next program. Just let these people talk to each other, and it's going to be a fascinating program. But I think you're exactly right about this. So let's start with the no. How it can't be done. It can't be done by, there's no law that you can pass in Congress or in Sacramento or in City Hall to mandate that kind of behavior. But what every single one of you knows as a leader, and for many of you as a parent, is what's the best way to change behavior is not by edict, although sometimes that does come in handy, but by modeling that behavior. And again, this is something I talk to my students about quite a bit. If the first question is, what's wrong with you? It's not going to lead to a very productive outcome. I like to say I've never convinced anyone of anything by telling them how stupid they were. But if the first question instead of what's wrong with you is, oh, how interesting, can you tell me how you've come to that conclusion? I'd love to hear more. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to agree with it. It means you're showing the other person or people a sufficient level of respect that they feel comfortable offering their opinion, which doesn't guarantee the kind of outcome you're hired to achieve. Thankfully, otherwise people wouldn't hire you to achieve it. But it dramatically increases the odds of it. If you can start out, not even just civilly, just curiously. I find curiosity to be one of the most underrated traits there is. And asking that kind of question in a curious and respectful way, I think is an important step in that direction. And if our elected leaders, going back to the character model I was talking about earlier, model that behavior on a national or a state or a world stage, again, it doesn't guarantee that everyone imitates it, but it certainly increases the likelihood of it.
So this answers the individual level. Is there anything that could be done on a collective level?
Yes and no. For those of you, this is not my area of expertise, Vanessa, you're going to need to bring in someone to talk about de Tocqueville at some point. But Alexis de Tocqueville who's a French philosopher and political scientist in the, oh, look at you. I was going to quote somebody from Britain in a minute ago, but this is much better. Alexis de Tocqueville. Yeah, okay. So when he came to this country, what he said made the United States such a unique and remarkable experiment was our community gatherings, our groups, our clubs, our associations. So once again, you don't pass a law that mandates this. But if you think about this in terms of concentric circles, you put together groups of people who want to have the conversation in the way that we've been discussing. And then you keep growing it. Whether it's lifelong learning, whether it's book clubs. Actually, just as an aside, I've always thought that book clubs require too much of people. I'm going to start an article club. So just read a couple of pages and it'll be much, much easier. But you put together a group of people who may not agree on anything other than the need to talk to each other in a respectful and curious way. And you gradually grow it outward. And because we're a tribal species, everyone's going to want to be part of that tribe.
So I think what you're trying to say, it's basically it can't be coerced by the government, but it could be done by nonprofit organizations that would encourage dialogue, right?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Now, I will say this, as someone who started his political career working for Ronald Reagan and concluded it working for John McCain, although I am now a political independent, and although I do leave my politics outside of my classroom in these kind of programs, I do believe the government does work at its best when it does a relatively small number of things extremely well, rather than trying to do too many things. And I don't know that it's fair, whether you're a conservative or liberal, to ask your government to solve these problems for us. We solve them for ourselves. So I think you and I are in agreement.
And it will take from democracy. Nothing, those things that are very related to personal behaviors shouldn't be coerced by the outside.
Exactly. Now I'm going to make Marie mad, but since I quoted a Frenchman, I'm going to quote a Brit. There's a famous quote from the Middle Ages. Some of you may have heard it, or an adage, a story. Any of you ever heard the story, for the want of a nail? Okay. For the want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For the lack of a shoe, a horse was lost. For the lack of a horse, a rider was lost. For the lack of a rider, a battle was lost. For the lack of a battle, a war was lost. For the lack of a war, a kingdom was lost. All for the lack of a nail. And so when we think about how we're going to do this, just like the dent in the universe, whatever he meant when he first said it, each nail adds up. And the more of these groups that exist, where people say we're going to get together on a regular basis, and not pretend that our differences don't exist, but talk about them in an honest and respectful and curious way. Each one of those is a nail. And that's how you win the war and save the kingdom.
My name is Terry Spath, and I didn't go to Pepperdine. I'm a friend of Pepperdine.
Where did you go?
I went to University of Michigan undergrad,
Okay.
and I studied
Go Blue.
Go Blue
And
national championship.
and where was your what was your major?
So I had two majors. I majored in economics and I majored in psychology. And economics, the founding sort of assumption was that every person, every company, every country, every government was rational. That was the starting assumption. And then I'd walk across the hall to my psych classes and they would say, we're going to start that no one's rational. And so I feel I've been confused my entire adult life. But I want to thank you very much for everything you've said. And I love this conversation about curiosity. I think that was a really profound, everything has been. And I'm really not sure how to phrase my question, except that you touched on the fact that you were very surprised in 2016. And I think some people were, some people weren't. And the people that were surprised were ones that paid a lot of attention to polls. And so my question is, I guess, around how did the polls, which had been reliable in the past, become unreliable? And if that's even a true statement. And then I guess part two of that question is, it seems to me that there's just certain people in certain counties in the country that really determine a presidency. And is that an accurate framework to look at things? And in which case do you only look at the married women in those particular small areas of the country? Is that a fair way to think about how things are really decided?
Okay, so two really important questions. And I'll apologize in advance because I don't know if I can do both of those questions justice in 90 seconds, but I'll do my best. I'll start with the second one because, at least in my mind, it's a bit easier. Our electoral system was designed by our founders for a number of reasons, but it was designed primarily to ensure the rights of the minority. And what Sass talks about in them is he talks about how the rights of the minority aren't just about protecting the minority from majority oppression. It's about reminding the majority of the importance of humility. Just because I have one more vote than you doesn't mean I'm right about everything and you're wrong about everything. An electoral college, by taking the election away from a raw popular vote, does force the candidates to put together coalitions of voters in different places. Now, because of the way our country has grown and defined itself in ways that the founders couldn't have ever imagined, we have a small number of states, like 6 or 7 states, that end up deciding elections because we know that California is going to vote in one way, we know that Texas is going to vote in the other. And often the conversation turns to whether we should get rid of the Electoral College. And I say that if you want the candidates to talk to more voters, I don't know that that's the way to do it. So if I were still running campaigns and you got rid of the Electoral College, I'll tell you exactly what I'd do, Terry, if I were running you for president. I would rent you an apartment near LAX. I rent you another one near JFK Airport, another one at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, another one in Houston, another one in Philadelphia, maybe one or two others. And I would fly you back and forth between the 5 or 6 biggest cities in the country over and over again and ignore the rest of the country, because that's where the biggest mass of popular votes would be. 2 states, the state of Maine and the state of Nebraska, do something that I think is very interesting. They also award their electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis, but they do it on the basis not of the entire state, but by congressional district. So every district has 1 electoral vote. And in Nebraska, there's 2 districts. So 1 vote is safely Republican, 1 goes back and forth between the 2 parties. If we were to do that here in California, you'd probably have about 30 Democratic electoral votes and about 20 Republican ones. So that might be an answer, but if your instinct is there's a small number of states and counties in those states that decide the election, that is the case, but that's not for political purposes. It's because we're the most mobile society in the history of the planet Earth. And we tend to want to live near people like us. And like we talked about earlier, for many years, we defined people like us as people who look like us. Now we define people like us as people who think like us. And so we move into communities that therefore become more ideologically uniform because we like it that way. On the polling, I will offer you this. I was surprised. One of the things that was mentioned in in that very, very long introduction, Vanessa, if we ever do this again, remind me to send you a shorter one, is I was the founder, and for many years, no longer, but for many years was the director of the USC LA Times political survey. And I will say, with still years later, mixed feelings, that ours was the only major poll in the country that called the election correctly. Our polls showed Donald Trump winning. I thought it was wrong. So that's exactly why I stopped making political predictions. But let me tell you why. Most political polls simply ask, who do you prefer, candidate A or candidate B? What some really smart people at USC came up with, not me, believe me, I just helped them with it. They came up with a plan that instead of asking, who do you support, Trump or Clinton? They said, we're going to ask 2 questions instead. Question number 1, on a scale of 1 to 100, how likely are you to vote for your preferred candidate? And on a scale of 1 to 100, how likely are you to vote? And so while more people in our survey said that they were voting for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, most of Clinton supporters were self-rating themselves somewhere in the low 60s, or excuse me, high 60s, low 70s. Most of Trump supporters were rating their intensity level in the low to mid 90s. And so by measuring not just preference, but intensity, we were able to get to a different outcome. The other reason I think a lot of polls missed that election is, remember I was talking earlier about how partisan voting behavior changed on different issues now, cultural issues rather than economic issues. One of those, and we've never seen this before 2016, was education. Voters without a college education. And I am not suggesting for a moment that voters who didn't go to college are any less or more intelligent than those who did. But voters who did not graduate from college are now overwhelmingly much more likely to vote Republican. Those with a college degree are much more likely to vote Democrat. And because we had never seen that in polling until 2016, the polls didn't account for education. We tried to measure gender and age and other demographic characteristics. We didn't try to create an educational accurate mix. And so, I'll go back to the NASCAR moms and NASCAR dads equation, that if you have an economically working class voter is less likely to have a college degree. It's also worth remembering, as most of us college graduates don't, the overwhelming majority of Americans did not graduate from college. And when I ask well-educated audiences to guess what they think the percentage of college graduates in our society is, the numbers, people guess in the 60%, the 70%, it's in the 30%. The other thing I would suggest is polls, and this is where I'll wrap this up. Polls have what's known as a margin of error. Now, polls aren't designed to predict outcomes. All polls are designed to do is tell you what people are thinking at the moment they're taken. There's no way to ascertain whether people are going to change their mind over the course of several months or even several weeks. And because it's not precise, what the pollsters do is they work in a little bit of a fudge factor. They call it a margin of error. And they say Smith is at 52% and Jones is at 48%, but there's a margin of error of 3 or 4 or 5%. So, so generally when you look at polls this year, what I would tell you is don't look at the raw numbers. What you want to look at is the trajectories. If you see a poll that shows Trump and Biden both at 45%, we have no idea if they're tied or if one of them's ahead. But if you see a poll that shows them at 45%, and the polls a few weeks earlier showed Trump a few points ahead, and a few weeks before that showed Trump further ahead, measure the trends. And so given how close the Trump-Clinton election was, it was within the margin of error. And because most of experienced professionals, as you said, thought that Hillary was going to win, they sort of overlooked that leading up to the election. They began looking at polls as predictors instead of saying Clinton may be slightly ahead, but it's within the margin of error. So while I like to brag about the USC LA Times poll, most of the other ones didn't get it wrong. They just didn't work nearly hard enough to remind us what it was they were measuring. We are over, and I'm more than happy to spend another few minutes if anyone else had questions that we didn't get to. I'm more than happy to stick around. But for those of you who have other obligations before you go, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for letting me join you today. But more than that, I want to thank you for being part of a program like this, because these are the kind of concentric circles I was talking about earlier. This is the way you set an example, and this is the way you lead us forward. So thank you very much for that. And if any of you would ever like to come in and sit on a class at Pepperdine, I would love to have you, so just let me know. Thanks so much.